Hello, everyone. Welcome to another one of our Shady Ministries studies, in which we will be discussing some of the more commonly and foundational questions you're going to need to know when studying, defending, and growing in your understanding of the Bible and everything we learn therein. So, discussing the Bible, the question today is, what is the historical order of the Old Testament? And while it does cover a lot of history and traverses three different categories of literature, it's a good idea to understand, at least in a broad sense, not only what's happening, but in what order, because recognizing the flow of a nation's history is also going to note similar themes when we see them repeated. Those who don't learn from history, as George Santayana once observed, are doomed to repeat it. So, before we get into all of that, and recognizing there is a flow to the Old Testament, there's this overarching theme that is consistent throughout the entirety of Scripture that needs to be kept in mind when reading through the poetry and as well recognizing what's being referenced in prophecy. I want to first clarify a particular word that's very often misunderstood within that statement. What is the historical order of the Old Testament? Well, what is history? Let's first clarify that. The word history is literally a translation of the word histor, which is comparable to our word for eyewitness news, people who are there to see the things happen that they are reporting. So, if history is what people saw happen in the past, just putting it as simply as we can, we test what they claim by finding as many people who say essentially the same thing and include the same major details, of course, since no two people are going to be giving the exact same story and looking at the exact same details in exactly the same way, let alone the major events, or the minor events rather. So we focus on the majors and don't go to bat on the minors. The second question, before we get into the historical order of the Old Testament, is what kind of history is the Old Testament? Because as what was stated before, there are different ways of telling the same story. Different cultures have different emphases on these sort of things. And for me to insist that the Bible is a good old-fashioned American novel, well, that's not the case. They're not going to write history like Americans. It was Jewish history, and Jewish culture, in particular 14th century BC Jewish culture, is going to naturally, of course, focus entirely on the nation of Israel and their relationship with God from creation all the way to 400 BC. That's the timeline, no, not the writing dates, but the timeline that the Old Testament covers. Also note that from the time of Adam to Abraham, Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob's sons all the way to Moses, we go on from there to review about 1,000 or so years of history as Israel prepares for the coming Messiah, the one that was promised to Adam and to Abraham, and so on it goes. Now, again, we want to make sure that we're clarifying how this was written. It's not an American style history, and they didn't clear it with us as far as how this was to be structured. They wrote things their way. So if I, as a 21st century American, or European, or Pakistani, or Chinese, or any other individual or citizen, am going to read into the Bible my culture, that's my first and probably most critical mistake. This is not only Jewish history, but was written in Jewish style. And how was that written? Well, again, since it's a Jewish record of history, it was written the way Jews traditionally recorded their history, which was centuries before Christ and several thousand years before America was even a thing. So this would be generally seen in two phases. First, they would overview the main events from start to finish as broadly as possible. Genesis 1 is a perfect example. Just overview all of creation. Man and woman were introduced just kind of as a side detail. Then the second phase would be to focus in on the topics they wish to discuss within those events. This is the Jewish style of history. So Genesis chapter 2, instead of moving on from the seventh day of creation, it goes back and focuses in on the sixth day of creation and how mankind came to be in further detail. That God's involvement wasn't just they showed up. It was actually personal. There was a statement that was made that would be relevant and a reference once again to the coming of Jesus. But All of these implications are meant to be understood within their own cultural context, not ours. And that's important because these writings for Jewish culture, in particular an oral Jewish culture, were all discussed publicly and generally distributed through speaking and memorization. Now, note, they had the writings there to make sure that they had the story straight, but they spoke and wrote in such a way where you would understand where and when these things took place based on the context of each event rather than how we do things with bullet points and numbered dates. Of course, the majority of the Bible encompasses the Jewish calendar, which is based on the lunar months. So if you're reading, say, the book of Exodus, and you wonder, it's on the 14th day of Nisan, and does that mean there's like a car sale or something? What's happening here? It's based on Jewish months. So an understanding of these things will also help and assist in understanding how this applies to us now. As they are writing these things, it is certainly foundational history, but the information is presented at a time and a place with a people, and they're not us. So we need to remember that. The Babylonian calendar is also utilized during Daniel's prophecy since he was in Babylon. But if you're going to notice something in particular in the prophets or in the books of the kings, that was the most frequent way they would date certain events. It was during the reign of King Uzziah, or during the reign of King Ahaz, or the reign of King Manasseh. If you have a familiarity with what these reigns were like, say for example Uzziah walked with the Lord, wasn't perfect, but it was a time of military prosperity and security for the nation. That would be an appropriate and familiar time for Isaiah to have his eyes turned towards God and see the ultimate king in his glory, especially when he passed away and he wondered, well, who's on the throne of Israel now? Oh, him. And that's the point. Likewise, Manasseh was one of the worst kings in Israel's history, and that's saying something. So to note that would be the time that a prophecy was given, or this was a time when a prophet died, you'd probably be able to put two and two together and figure out how that whole thing went down. So continuing on then. With all of these things clarified for us, what is history, what kind of history, in what way was the history written, what was the culture and the background of this history, there are 25 main events I'd like to overview with you all here today, just to give you in the most broad strokes possible. As Skip Heitzig, my father, and many others have often said, it's the Bible from 20,000 feet. You're looking down in a very broad sense. You're not picking out minor details, but you're focusing on the major and key ones. And ironically enough, the overwhelming majority of these, at least the first half, are all contained within the first book. So it's important to have an understanding of Genesis before you catch the intended history that sets the narrative for the Bible going forward. So, the first major event is, obviously, as we read in Genesis, that God creates the earth out of nothing and from nothing. And he then introduces light, land masses, plant life, the stars, sea and air animals, and then land animals in that order, concluding with the creation of man and woman. They would be in the land animal category, but because they bore the image of God, they were unique. They had dominion over creation, and that authority and value was given to them above the animals. The second major event is that mankind is noted to have been created for a relationship with God and is given the choice to reject that relationship through their recipiation of one or another tree, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They have one law: don't touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And with that perfect nature, violated that one standard. Since all of creation was under their authority and they separated themselves from God, all of creation went with them, thus the world we're living in today. The third major event is that God makes the first messianic promise to Adam and Eve after their fall. After they separate themselves from God, he doesn't even finish the chapter before making a promise to Eve that one will come from your seed. Notice, the woman's seed, not man and woman's seed, but from the woman, that he would crush the serpent's head, in reference to, of course, the enemy, his power of death. He would bruise, obviously, her heel, or his heel. But the major event, beginning off in the third event of the Bible. On top of creation and on top of a relationship severed, we already have a promise of restoration within the 3rd chapter. Then moving on, Adam and Eve start having children at this point, and the 4th major event notes that their first son, Cain, is given that name because they expect him to be that promised one, that Messiah. They're grieved to discover that he was in fact the first murderer, and his descendants follow his example. So, noting the descendants of Cain, you notice a pattern of violence. This is also summarized for us with one of Cain's descendants, who essentially made the first metal album, who explains to his homegirls that if Cain is going to be avenged sevenfold, then I'll be avenged 77-fold. If someone kills Cain, then they'll be killed. Well, if someone hurts me, I'm going to kill them and their whole family. And you see this trend develop. So then also note that while mankind is going a fallen direction, it's not everybody. Another child is mentioned to have been produced from Adam and Eve, who were the mother and father of all living, and his name was Seth. Now, we're not told all of Adam and Eve's children, but Seth in particular singled out because his family lineage is noteworthy in being one of the last ones that would have a relationship with God. We have certain individuals that stand out. Methuselah was the longest living person. He was a part of Seth's family. Enoch had a relationship with God after his first son was born, and he actually was a foreshadowing, interestingly, of the rapture. We also see and continue on all the way to Noah and his birth right around the time of Adam's death. So Noah then is introduced to the world, and it is at this point that mankind is, definitely divided into 2 directions. You have the godly family of Seth, and you have the ungodly family of Cain. Now, the 5th major event, rather, is that the families of Seth, the godly line, and the families of Cain, the ungodly line, began to intermarry. And as we all, I'm sure, very familiar and will be informed with going forward, that when you intermarry with people who don't have a relationship with God, say, for example, King Ahab and Jezebel, it doesn't turn out well. The knowledge and a desire for a relationship with the true and living God has all but disappeared from mankind at this point in their history, and they're on the verge of modeling great-grandpappy Cain's mindset. Violence has covered the face of the earth, and mankind's basically on the verge of wiping themselves out. So, interestingly enough, event 6 is then noting God's intervention. Instead of allowing mankind to kill themselves through violence, he causes the planet to flood. And he also, in full style and setting the tone going forward for when he judges sin, spares those who accepted his warnings and means of escape that were provided 120 years in advance by Noah. Noah's family and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, repopulate the earth. Shem would make up the majority of the foundations of Asian and Middle Eastern culture. Ham would populate the majority of African cultures, and Japheth would go north into Russia and Europe, and thus the 3 major ethnic groups. We all come from Noah, but we're divided into these general categories because of the intention and order that God said to spread us out, to fill the earth, not to just circulate in one area. Now, the 7th major event is that mankind, in full consistency with what we've seen so far, unites together in rebellion against God, refusing to fill the earth, and instead start inventing fake gods, known as idols, and worship them through the construction of towers, temples, and ziggurats, just pyramid-like structures. God intervenes upon the construction of one of their largest ones, the famous Tower of Babel, and through the introduction of various languages, the cultures that were united have to go and find different groups that have obeyed God and spread out across the earth, looking for people who share their same languages, and thus the earth is filled and the introduction of language is established. Event number 8. One of the descendants of Shem, the Middle Eastern to Asian cultures, by the name of Abraham, is made a promise by God to continue the promise that was made to Adam and Eve, and he is told to move from his city Ur, which is in modern-day Iraq, all the way to Canaan, which is known as modern-day Israel. He brings his family along and has his first legitimate son, Isaac, at the age of 100. This is, of course, miraculous. He begins warning Canaan that their behavior will warrant judgment from God if they continue, and that judgment would ultimately occur 700 years after they continuously reject God's mercy. Event number 9. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son, who he loves, and by the way, that is the first time in the Bible, Genesis 22, where the word love appears in the Bible, a father's love for his only son. Noting then that this was something familiar for a pagan culture that he undoubtedly grew up in and was surrounded by in Canaan, was told by God to sacrifice this son. And ironically enough as well, the mountain of which God told him to sacrifice Isaac was the same mountain that Jesus would be crucified on 2,000 years later, the peak of the mountain known as Moriah. After being willing to obey God's command under the assumption, the willingness to trust that, look, God, you promised that this would be your promised lineage, that this would be the one that your Messiah would come through, but he hasn't had any kids yet, so either you're going to raise him from the dead or you have a problem here. But I recognize that that's your problem and you can deal with it. Well, as we know, the pretext that was established for us and also further clarified in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham's relationship with God trusted him just that far, that he trusted that Isaac would be able to be risen from the dead. And so God stops the knife before he is able to sacrifice his son, and this sets a pretext for all of Abraham's descendants going forward, that while the gods, quote unquote, of the other nations love human sacrifice for some reason, this was a no-no for people who follow the true and living God. And it was also, of course, incredibly foreshadowing of something else. So Abraham finds a godly wife for Isaac, and Isaac produces twins by the name of Jacob and Esau. Esau was supposed to receive the inheritance, but a prophecy was made before either of them were even born that it would be Jacob who would inherit the promise, and indeed he did. And this brings us to event number 10. Esau rejects his birthright, and Jacob inherits God's promise, where he then goes on to move to his relative's home, where he has 12 sons. This brings us to event number 11. These 12 sons make up the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is the favorite of the family, which again isn't encouraged, it's just simply acknowledged. And his brothers try to sell him into slavery. Also, again, not encouraged, just simply acknowledged. And ironically enough as well, while Joseph is in Egypt, God blesses him there. He raises him to a position of power and uses him to make Egypt essentially the world-dominating superpower of that day. They prepare for a famine well in advance and have enough food to provide for all of the nations around them that are affected by it. So Egypt and its rise to power credited to Israel, to Jacob and their involvement, but for the next 400 years, Israel's relationship within Egypt as a nation within a nation. They are not Egyptian, they're Hebrews, but they still live there and do so peacefully. Well, 400 years passes, and it says at the beginning of Exodus that a Pharaoh rose up in Egypt who did not know Joseph. He didn't know his nation's history, and he didn't know why the Jews were there, and so his paranoid assumptions got the better of him. And this brings us to event number 12. Moses is born during a time where the current Pharaoh believes the Jews are not a current, but a potential threat, and decides to exterminate them by murdering all of their boys, hoping the Jewish girls will intermarry with the Egyptians and their ethnic identity would disappear. Instead, ironically enough, God sets things up where Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter and adopts him as her own. He was drawn out of the river in a basket. Moses' name, Moishe, in Egyptian means drawn out of water, so that's where we get his name. Also note that after 40 years of growing up on Pharaoh's dime, he sees the abuse of his fellow Jews and wants to free them. To demonstrate this, he murders an Egyptian that was abusing somebody. Israel, unfortunately, rejects Moses' authority over them, and now Pharaoh sees him as the troublemaker, the reason why he wanted to exterminate the Jews before Hitler tried it. Little has changed, as you can see. So Moses flees to the wilderness of Sinai, this triangular region, modern day Saudi Arabia and Egypt, between that area, where he spends those 40 years married. He has several kids, and he's essentially brought from royalty to rags. He's made from a ruler to a shepherd, and in an Egyptian mindset, that's not a preferred occupation. It was after these 40 years that God personally called him back to Egypt with miracles to show that God was, in fact, speaking for him. He didn't expect Pharaoh to trust him without backing up his words with deeds. Event number 13, Pharaoh rejects God's authority, and God responds by duplicating every single pagan god that they had come up with's power and showing that he was actually the one in charge of these things. Israel is finally freed from slavery and are repaid for 400 years of unpaid labor. Pharaoh goes back on his agreement to allow the people of Israel to go free and tries to massacre Israel, how original, at the Red Sea's borders. Instead, God drowns them in the ocean and brings Israel back to where he appeared to Moses. This would be what was known as Mount Sinai. Event number 14, Israel sees God manifest in a cloud of fire and lightning, and he audibly tells them their new laws now that they are an independent nation from Egypt. Until this time, they just followed Egypt's laws and understood that the God of their ancestors was different. Now they had seen the God of their ancestors do things in their lifetime, and he would be their head of state. He would be their king. Now, they agree to keep this law and all the requirements thereof. If I disobey this law, I will incur these penalties. If I obey this law, I will receive these blessings. And this is essentially the establishment of the Old Covenant. The Old Testament covenant is interchangeable, and we'll discuss that in a future study. And they also recognize Moses as God's representative with a three-figurehead leadership structure to Israel, along with 70 elders. You can consider them mayors or congressmen if you'd like, but Miriam was a woman, by the way. Aaron and Moses all held leadership positions as representatives of God, and God was recognized as the head of state. Event number 15, Israel, following the trend, breaks the covenant after 40 days, after agreeing to giant fireball lightning cloud, and commits idolatry. This was performed with a massive and group sexual encounter around the golden calf, which was shaped and modeled after the Egyptian god Apis. Instead of wiping out the entire nation, which God would be legally obligated to do, God only orders those who started the rebellion against the laws they agreed to keep to be put to death, as they knew would be the penalty. Event number 16, Israel moves on from this interesting moment to the promised land, but are intimidated by the size of the people and the cities. Of the representatives they sent in, only 2 of them trust God enough to give them what he said he would. These were Joshua and Caleb. God, interestingly enough, the rest of the nation, the 10 representatives and the nation that followed the majority vote, tried to murder Moses and Aaron for sending them all on a suicide mission against Canaan. God defends them and, well, of course, tells them that they're going to spend the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness as a judgment for rejecting his promises. They weren't going to receive it anyway, so he was going to wait until their kids could inherit the promise, and they all died out. Only Joshua and Caleb lived long enough to not only enter Canaan, but would continue even to the first chapter of the book of Judges. They would see the introduction to the promised land after Moses' death. Event number 17, Israel enters Canaan after the 700 years have been fully exhausted that God predicted in Genesis 15. And Israel fights with them for 7 years. Those who ask for mercy, individuals like Rahab and her family and Jericho, were spared. Also, entire nations that surrendered to Israel were spared, like the Gibeonites. But on the other hand, the nations that were attacked and destroyed actually took the incentive and attacked Israel first. These were defeated in battle, but were not completely driven out of the land. And that's important to note, because then in event 18, the time of the judges comes about. The book of Judges itself covers about 400 years of Israel's history, where they are harassed, invaded, and enslaved by the Canaanites they should have driven out of the land, but refused to. So when they stopped worshiping idols and asked God for help, we see a seven-circled cycle where they ask God for mercy. He raises up a judge, a figurehead, a leader. They drive out the oppressors. They fall back into idolatry. They're taken over because when you reject God, He's under no obligation to protect you or owes you anything to prevent bad things from happening and so forth. And the cycle continues. The final judge, of course, concludes with the judge Samuel, who was the one responsible for anointing Israel's first king, Saul, and Israel's greatest king, David. But I get ahead of myself. After the time of Judges, event number 19 includes Israel, once again, rejecting God's authority, and asks for a king so that they can be like the other nations. After a fair warning, Saul is chosen, but he doesn't have a relationship with God, and over time becomes a murderous and insane tyrant. A shepherd boy by the name of David, likewise, fights a battle against one of the Canaanite groups they should have driven out of the land, named the Philistines, the famous Goliath encounter, and he wins a battle that Saul would have lost. So he gains a lot of notoriety for all this, but on top of this as well, as a reward for defeating Goliath and liberating Israel from another one of its oppressors, he allows him to marry his daughter Michal. So he's legally married into the royal family. Now, of course, Saul's mind continues to deteriorate, but David continues to rise up in the ranks. He becomes an accomplished general. He is again a part of the royal family, and he is told by God from a very young age that he would be the one to succeed Saul as the one who he wants to rule over his people. Event number 20, after Saul's family eventually all die in battle, the majority of which took place at the end of 1 Samuel, but others, like Ishbosheth and Abner and others, Abner was his bodyguard, but you catch the point, were assassinated by their enemies, not under David's orders, by the way. David legally is the last member of that family, and all of Saul's surviving relatives, instead of being wiped out like things usually go in the Middle East, he adopts them as members of his family. Mephibosheth is the most significant of which. So then moving on from that, event number 20 concludes by noting that David did make similar mistakes that Saul made, but he had a relationship with God, and that is ultimately reflected by his legacy. But history is honestly recorded. Event number 21, David passes on the throne to his son Solomon. He had many sons, but he chose Solomon in particular, as God directed him to. And two separately good and bad things happened to Israel. The good thing was that the temple of God was built by Solomon, and this was to replace the tabernacle of Moses, this tent meeting place where the sacrifices would be offered up until this point. And Solomon, unfortunately as well, also built pagan altars throughout Israel to appease his many, many wives, which, if you remember in Deuteronomy, he was not supposed to for that very reason. See the issue in Genesis about intermarrying with people who don't share your relationship with God. Anyway, so moving on to event 22, Solomon's son Rehoboam is a moron. Not much nicer way I can say it. And Jeroboam is told by God that he has a chance to lead 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel to or away from God. The predicted division happens, and the northern 10 tribes of Israel separate themselves from the southern 2, Judah and Benjamin. These remain under Rehoboam's authority. Jeroboam gains the authority of the northern 10 tribes and obviously the overwhelming majority of the nation of Israel. Unfortunately, Jeroboam doesn't follow God and embraces idolatry, worshiping the Egyptian god Apis, the golden calves. History may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, doesn't it? So, continuing on to event 23, Israel and Judah, these are recognized as two separate nations from this point, beginning in the book of 1 Kings, have their series of kings and prophets, going from Isaiah all the way to probably, not of course, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, but noting the majority of the prophets are speaking at this time leading up to their exiles. Israel and Judah for 200 years in the north and 300 years in the south continually reject God's warnings of coming judgment, that they not only have the law of God, but they're being held to the law of God. They know better. And like the other nations, they were given centuries to stop doing these things, knowing that God was better, but chose to do them anyway. And note, the things weren't just so ceremonious as bowing down to some ugly statue that looks like a refugee from an Eastern island head. No, when the Bible says idolatry, there were particular activities that were associated with these gods. As mentioned before, Apis was observed through massive sexual encounters, also called orgies. Moloch was worshipped through burning newborn infants on brass ovens alive as a ancient method of abortion. Very little has changed. We just throw them in a blender nowadays, and it's totally different. Anyway, sarcasm. Baal his name means master, and you would worship Baal through bloodletting, not only cutting yourselves and obviously intermingling with the blood of the other things that are bleeding around you, but also it was considered a pious act to murder those who didn't share your religious convictions. That was part and parcel of Baal worship, which is why Jezebel, one of the most wicked queens of Israel's history, along with her granddaughter, who also was very scary, both went out of their way to persecute, hunt down, and exterminate the prophets of God during their time, Elijah being one of them. And this was in accordance with their worship of the pagan god Baal. There are others which are not appropriate for me to discuss, and I know I've already mentioned some very inappropriate things, but trust me, I could go into details that would curl your hair. You read the Bible, it's a book written for adults. If you're not prepared for it, don't read it. But continuing on with the honest history, Israel is judged for these heinous acts. And as the 200 years are exhausted for the northern 10 tribes of Israel, we reach event 24. Assyria, not Syria, but Assyria, their capital city was Nineveh, takes the northern 10 tribes into captivity as punishment for their sins, and as the prophets predicted, they are returned after a period of time and given another chance. Now, those who returned, unfortunately, rejected a relationship with God, and they became known as the Samaritans because the capital in northern Israel was Samaria, this, of course, leaving Jerusalem. The southern 2 remaining tribes came back to God on occasion, but for the most part they were just as wicked, if not more so, than the northern 10 tribes. And after 300 years of mercy, they are taken into captivity by Babylon. Now, Babylon, modern-day Iraq, is essentially a very different change of pace, but being named after Babel, that's where idolatry was invented. So a very ironic twist that they were judged for idolatry in the place where idolatry was invented. Notice the callback. But Babylon eventually was held accountable for their deeds too. After destroying the temple of God, they are taken over by Persia after a period of time, and the last of Israel's enemies from the time of the judges, in particular the Amalekites, are wiped out, or rather wipe themselves out, during the time of Esther. And this would essentially conclude the historical structure of the Old Testament. During this time, of course, prophets are speaking, and we note where in the timeline, based off of what kings, what months, based on the Jewish lunar or Babylonian calendar, and on it goes. But if we're going to just summarize all of this to make it even more memorable, 10 major events. The creation of mankind, the rebellion of mankind, the flood and judgment, the promise to Abraham, the covenant with Jacob's children, the founding of Israel, the time of the judges, the time of the kings, the time of exile, and the time of restoration, where they would wait for 400 years for the Messiah's coming. If you have any questions or would like to know more specific details, let me know in the comments. I look forward to discussing more of these issues with you, and next time we'll be discussing the New Testament. I look forward to it, and I will see you guys tomorrow. God bless you.